Chapter 5. The back door of the hotel opened into an alleyway with the small residence on the other side of it. Pat Stevens swung to the right side around the hotel, with his informalized deputy's crew right at his heels. He slowed as he approached the front of the building on the street corner and motioned his deputies to stay back while he cautiously peered around the corner and down Main Street towards the Dutch Springs Bank on the opposite side and near the other side of the block. He drew back after a slow survey of the street and said grimly, "Everything looks quiet in the front of the bank. You, Jim, Todd, Ben, Max, and Slim. You five, you string out on both sides of the street and saunter down to the bank, slow-like. Just act like nothing's happening, and don't tell anyone nothing. Couple of you stay on this side of the street opposite the bank. Other three, cross over and mosey up close. Stay right there where you can cover the front, but don't start nothing till they try to come out that way. If they do, don't waste any lead trying to cripple them. Mark Johnson," Pat went on swiftly to the grizzled rancher that was right behind him. "You gather up 10 men and take 'em around back to the hotel and through the alley to the back of the block. Start drifting 'em across the street and around behind the bank. Spread your men out along the block of the street and that side of the bank and pick your men. Get started." While Johnson was swiftly selecting the 10 men to go with him, Pat told the others, "We'll string along and cross the street to this end and go up behind the bank from this side. Last 2 men stay on this end to block off the street. You others, you spread out about 50 feet apart so there won't be any chance of anyone getting through. We don't want nothing like the last time the bank was robbed. That was about 7 years ago, when Sam and Ezra and me had to trail a gang down into New Mexico. I'll go first, and I'll get right up behind the bank. You, Walter," Pat ordered the young puncher who had brought the alarm. "Come along with me and tell me more about it. We gotta get going." He stepped forward from behind the concealment of the building and sauntered across the moonlight, dusty street. Walter was following him about 50 feet, and when Pat reached the shadow of the building on the other side, he stopped and waited for the cowboy to reach his side. He nodded with grim satisfaction as another man stepped around into the bright moonlight and started across as Walter stepped up onto the boardwalk. That would do it. If they'd all be as casual and take their time in following each other, the chances were that the lookout wouldn't notice anything was amiss. That is, if the bank robbers had a lookout posted to watch the street. He caught Walter's arm as the youth reached his side and started hurrying him around to the alley leading down behind the bank and questioned him. "How'd you come to get into it, Walter? You think anyone noticed that you was coming for me?"
"I don't think so, Mr. Stevens."
Walter's teeth were chattering, but he made a manful effort to hide his nervousness.
"I was coming across the alley when I heard a funny noise at the back door of the bank. It's in a dark shadow and I couldn't see good, so I stopped and listened."
"What were you doing back in the alley?"
"I'd been to see. I was visiting Miss Grubbs that lives across the alley from the bank. Miss Jane. I took the shortcut when I left her house."
They turned into the alley, and Pat said, "Keep talking."
"Well, like I said, I heard a funny noise, but I couldn't see anything, so I sort of crouched down and waited. Then I heard it again. It was a loud creaking like the back door was maybe being pried open. And then I saw a flame that looked like a match being struck that was inside the bank. So I knew something was wrong, and I hightailed it around and asked at the Gold Eagle for you. Somebody said you was at the Jewel. I guess that's all, I reckon."
"You didn't tell him at the Gold Eagle what was up?"
"No, I figured I'd best find you."
"And you didn't see anyone? Don't know how many there are? Don't know where they got their horses hitched for a fast getaway?"
"No, sir, Mr. Stevens, I don't." the young youth admitted regretfully. I figured I best hurry and get you.
Well, you did just right. Pat squeezed his arm and lowered his voice. Hang on, we're coming up to the bank now. You're right, son. There's a light on there inside. It's pretty dim. Must be coming out of the vault. Pat stopped and ordered briskly. You stay right here. You stop the first man to come up and keep him here with you. The others will be scattered out behind, and I figure we got 'em trapped. They ain't got a chance to get away. I'm going to try and engine up to that back door and be a reception committee of one when they try and come out with the money. He left the lad posted there and moved forward slowly and cautiously toward a dull square light that showed through the dirty back window of the bank. There was empty tin cans and debris scattered out there in the rear of the bank building, and Pat had to move with the utmost caution to keep his progress noiseless. He had one gun out and ready to fire as he crept forward. The darkness here was made black and complete by the high wall of the building on the east that was blocking off the rays of the moon that was still low above the horizon. It'd be smart, Pat figured, for the robbers to have left one man outside the bank on guard with their horses. If he could surprise that man and then seize the horses, their only means of escape would effectively be cut off. He crouched far forward to make his body into the smallest target possible, and moved forward one cautious step after another without seeing or hearing anything to indicate the presence of any other living thing in the area of the blackness behind the bank. A dog came trotting up the alley behind Pat. He stopped and sniffed the air, and then let out a short, curious bark. Pat sank back onto his haunches and set his teeth together tightly. The dog started to arm slowly on stiff legs. Pat stayed very still, cursing old dogs under his breath, and this member of the breed in particular. It was a small spotted dog with one floppy ear and the other was pointed and alert. He stopped 10 feet from Pat and barked again. Pat sucked air between his lips to make a soft, welcoming sound. The dog trotted closer and stopped again to sniff the air suspiciously, then came on and rubbed against the sheriff enthusiastically, making small whimpering sounds to indicate his delight. Pat scratched him behind the ears with his left hand, patted him and whispered, "You stay here, dog. Better not get any closer, might get in some trouble." But the dog was not willing to lose his newfound friend so easily. When Pat started forward on hands and knees, he trotted past him towards the bank, and then stopped to look back and wag his tail encouragingly. Pat moved on, stayed close to the ground, and disregarded the spotted pup as best he could. Complete silence blanketed the dark, shadowed scene. Not a sound came from the main street beyond the bank. The deputy's men had been wholly successful in closing in to surround the bank on all 4 sides without warning the robbers. Pat Stevens was grimly sure the trap was set this time, and he gave up his plan to try and locate the horses of the thieves. With every avenue of escape closed to them, Pat turned directly toward the bank, bent on smoking them out into the open where they could be disposed of or captured. The little dog ran ahead of him to the back door of the bank, and he stopped there and wagged his tail furiously, and while Pat got close enough, he saw that the heavy door was sagging open. Still, no sound came from within the bank itself. The yellow blotch of light remained as the only concrete evidence of marauders within. Pat Stevens lifted himself to his feet when he was within 10 feet of the open back door. He hesitated, and then stepped sideways towards the lit window. The dog trotted to him and rubbed against his legs, so Pat stopped to pat him on the head, and then got close to the window and tried to peer inside. The glass was so dirty with accumulated grime that Pat couldn't see anything at all. He stood close to the window and listened intently, but no sound came from within. "They were damn funny bank robbers," he told himself. What were they doing inside the lit bank so long? They must realize their danger, yet they were staying long enough to have a picnic. Didn't make sense. Didn't add up to the way bank robbers were supposed to act. He pushed his Stetson back and scratched his head and turned to make a long survey of the darkness behind him. He could still see nothing, but he knew that the armed men waited there, waited impatiently for a chance to be throwing lead. He knew how volunteered posses were. Sooner or later, one of the deputized men was going to get tired of waiting and would do something that would give the alarm. And that might be disastrous. At the very least, it was likely to bring more bloodshed than would probably be spilt if the robbers walked into the trap unknowingly. Pat turned back from the window and cat-footed along the wall to the open back door. He paused on the threshold, gun in hand, staring inside to the blackness, and tried to get the layout of the rear of the interior of the bank clearly in his mind. There was only a faint glow of light from far inside to the right. That meant the thieves were on the other side of the wooden partition where the bank's money was kept in a fireproof vault. He knew the door to that vault was none too strong. It could be forced by determined men. As a director of the bank, he had often urged the purchase of a burglar-proof safe, but the other directors had always voted him down on the idea, insisting that no one in Powder Valley was likely to rob the bank and that no strangers could possibly know how easily the money could be obtained. The rear door, for instance, had only a stout chain and a padlock on it, yet that precaution was considered sufficient. Pat felt along the side of the door frame cautiously and discovered that the 3 heavy staples holding the chain had simply been pried out of the yielding wood. With an iron bar or a pickaxe for leverage, it would have been absurdly simple for a strong man to open the door and just walk in. Suddenly, while he hesitated there, the light went out inside the bank. Pat's body stiffened, and his fingers tightened on the butt of his gun. He heard furtive scraping sounds on the other side of the partition. He took one step forward, over the threshold, flattened himself against the inside wall beside the door. The little dog whimpered outside, and then trotted confidently through the open door. He nuzzled his cold nose against Pat's boot leg, then trotted on across the wooden floor towards the point where the dim light had shone. His toenails made a light clacking sound across the bare pine boards. The clacking sound stopped, and the little dog whimpered loudly. Pat heard a faint chuckle from ahead in the blackness, and then the sound of heavy boot heels crunching towards the door, towards Pat Stevens. Pat crouched against the wall with his gun ready. He strained his ears for further sound to indicate how many men were inside the bank. He heard only that single pair of boots, rapidly nearing him. The owner of the boots were evidently worn by a heavy man, completely without fear or any contemptuous of any effort that might be made to stop him. His heels thudded down heavily upon the floor, in measured cadence, as though he marched in time with an unheard drum. Pat had to make a swift decision while the man went past. He could have touched him, could have thrust his gun forward and triggered it with the muzzle against the robber's body, but if there were any more of them back there, that would give them alarm and give them some chance to escape, or to barricade themselves inside the bank building where they might be driven out only by a lot of gunfire. In that split second, Pat decided to let this one pass. The trap was well laid outside. There was no possibility of escape if he was allowed to walk into it blind. The man hesitated on the threshold. In that brief instant, his body and head were silhouetted against the moonlit sky, and Pat Stevens was looking at the huge bulk and scarred features of One-Eyed Ezra, his longtime gun partner and bosom friend. No time to weigh friendship against duty. No time to consider what the consequences might be. There was only one time for Sheriff Pat Stevens to know that Ezra must somehow be saved. Right and wrong did not enter into it. There was no time to declare himself, no chance to question why Ezra had suddenly turned to bank robbing. Pat only knew that he couldn't let Ezra be captured this way, just as he couldn't leave Sam Sloane's knife in the back of the dead man in the Jewel Hotel. As Ezra took a forward step into the night, Pat tilted the muzzle of his gun high and triggered it 3 times in rapid succession. He heard a single grunt of astonishment from the red-headed man, and then the lunging forward of a huge body. Pandemonium broke out then in response to Pat's 3 shots. The overly nervous guards in the alley began shooting wildly, shouting to each other and running forward to close in on the unseen robber. Pat stayed in the doorway. He heard the sudden thunking of hooves through the tumult. Ezra was mounted and was driving straight ahead out of the trap so carefully laid. Up and down the alley, men were running forward, betraying the fact that escape was closed off in both those directions. The thudding hooves drove straight forward, and Ezra sent his mount crashing through a flimsy board fence into the grub's backyard, while behind him men fired futility at the speeding shape. Pat ran forward, shouted loudly and with authority as a rider came galloping up from the west end of the alley. "I'll take that horse!" His voice lifted above the incoherent shouts and curses of the others. "This here's the sheriff." The rider pulled up reluctantly, and Pat grabbed the reins. "Get out of the saddle, sonny. I'll take after that varmint." The rider was a boy in his teens. He leapt from the saddle without hesitation. Pat vaulted into the saddle without touching stirrups and drove spurs into the horse's flanks. The startled animal leapt forward on Ezra's tail, and Pat turned to shout back, "Gather up a posse and follow me." He leaned low on the horse's neck and guided him through the grub's yard to the street beyond. He checked his momentum to catch the sound of his fleeing friend, and nodded grimly when he heard 2 horses galloping away madly to the east. He neck-reined his mount in that direction and gave him his head eastward to a point of a quarter of a mile from town, where the road forks northeastward and due south into the mountains. He pulled his horse up at the forks and threw himself off, and dropped to the ground with his head flat against the soil of the crossroads. His ear caught the faint vibrations of drumming hooves from the south fork. He got up slowly and brushed the dust from his clothes and remounted and turned his horse to face a group of angry mounted men surging out from Dutch Springs. "He went that way," Pat shouted loudly, and he pointed in the direction away from the one he knew Ezra had chosen. "Up the North Fork. You men ride after him. I gotta get back to town on something else." He sat slouched in the saddle at the crossroads and watched the determined posse sweep away northeastward on a wild goose chase. There was a bitter taste of overwhelming defeat in his mouth as he rode slowly back to town. He caught himself remembering that scene in Winter's store when he had been sworn in as sheriff and given the silver badge to wear as evidence of the confidence of his fellow citizens that they had in him. His hand went up to it and crept inside his shirt pocket to touch the cold smoothness of that silver star. He jerked the badge out angrily and drew back his arm to throw it away into the night, but something wouldn't let him commit that final act of sacrilege. He slowly slid the star back into his pocket, though with a look of bitter loathing upon his face. When a man took the oath of sheriff, he was supposed to give up having friends. He was sworn to enforce the law. Yet tonight, he had deliberately gotten rid of murder evidence against one man and had deliberately permitted another man to escape the consequences of robbing the local bank. In his heart, Pat Stevens hated himself for what he had done. Yet, in his heart, he knew too that Under the same circumstances, he would have done it again. Sheriff or no sheriff, Silver Star or no Silver Star, Sam Sloan and Ezra were his friends. No matter what they had done, they were still his friends. Nothing could alter that. It was something that happened to a man. You don't look for friendships, but you don't throw it away when it comes to you. It brings certain duties with it, and foremost of those is that you shall not forsake your friend. Pat Stevens didn't put any such thoughts into words as he rode back to Dutch Springs, but they were in his heart, in essence, and he knew that there they would stay. End of chapter 5.